Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining me today. My name is Trish Thacker. I'm a licensed therapist, and I've worked with patiently waiting for a few years now, talking about issues of attachment and trauma and working through any of the barriers that we might have in our relationships with our children, with each other, with our partners, friends, family, and things like that. As is true for most people who come into counseling or any field of study, we come into it out of our own curiosity. So I've become a student of this field and a practitioner in this field out of my own work in working my way through attachment and trauma issues. So I'm really happy to be here. I count it a privilege. There's a number of you that might be returning, so I welcome you back, and I'm really happy to be joining you again. And I'm really happy to be joining Patiently Waiting and your community for this 6-part series. So what we'll do is we'll have 6 podcasts. They'll be on the last Monday of each month. And we'll be talking about attachment, trauma, temperament, shame, finding calm, and then putting it all together. And 2 weeks after each podcast or each webcast, we'll have a live question and answer session. So please feel free to write things down and ponder these things after we talk about them so that we can meet together and answer any of the questions that you have. So we'll have 30 to 45-minute podcasts, as I said, once a month with the question and answer periods afterward. And as I said, I'm really happy to be joining you. So thank you so much. Now I'm going to share my screen. So it just takes a minute. If you'll hang with me while I bring my PowerPoint online. All right, here it comes. So while that's loading, as I said, I just want to thank you again for joining me today. I invite you in this time to take a moment, there it is, but to take a moment and check in with yourself. We'll go through the PowerPoint now, and I'll invite you to check in again in just a minute. So again, my name is Trish Thacker. I'm a licensed therapist. I've been a therapist for over 20 years. I currently work as the executive director at the Salvation Army Harbor Light Center in downtown Minneapolis, and have advanced training in interpersonal neurobiology, trauma, EMDR, forensics, narrative therapy, and addictions. So take a minute, as I said, take a deep breath if you'd like, and ask yourself, what is it that you're hoping to get out of today's session? We know from research and working with adult learners and people who are curious that if we have an idea what we want to get out of a learning experience, we're more likely to actually meet the goal and focus on the things that are important to us. So take a moment and ask yourself, what are you hoping to get out of our time together today? And again, kind of another check-in here. We're going to be talking about attachment today. This is our first session. And for some people, this can be really uncomfortable. There's nothing wrong with that. It's really actually fairly typical because as we talk about how we've developed in our relationships with our family of origin and our primary caregivers, it can get hard. So just acknowledge that. And I'd invite you to check in with yourself. Take a deep breath, close your eyes if you'd like to. And then ask yourself, check in, how are you feeling? Do you feel ready to listen and learn and to contemplate, think about the information that we're going to talk about? If you don't feel ready, what do you think you need to do in order to feel ready? Is there a task that's bothering you? Do you need to send a text? Do you need to close the door? Do you need to take care of something, write something down? I encourage you to do that. I invite you to do that so that you can do anything that will increase your ability to be present and to get the most out of our time together. So if that's what you need to do, go ahead and pause and then come back, and we'll be happy to have you rejoin us. And with that, then we'll continue. I also just always like to talk about a complexity disclaimer. So we're going to be talking about attachment from an interpersonal neurobiology lens. So we're going to talk about brain structure and processes and things like this. So these are obviously extremely complex topics. There are people that devote their entire lives to researching just individual areas of mirror neurons and empathy and the development of attachment and brain scans and things like that. So what we're talking about here are principles. It's a place to start. It's a place to develop some framework of understanding. So again, we'll be talking about some complex ideas, but hopefully presenting them in a way that is meaningful and accessible. All right, so here is our hand model of the brain. This was developed by Dan Siegel in his book, Mind Sight. Great book if you're interested in any of that kind of reading. And we're going to talk about this because it's a simple way to envision the concept of information flow through our brain, and we can use it through this hand model. And then it's always accessible because your hand is always there. Some people call it a handy model of the brain, but we'll just call it the hand model of the brain for our purposes. So our brains and bodies are intricately connected. The information is flowing back and forth all the time. But for the purposes of discussion and understanding, we often need to start with one place, start with the body, start with the brain. So we're going to start here. So when information comes in from our body, that message, so here's the brain, here's our hand. So that message will come up our spinal cord to the brainstem. It'll go through the limbic area, through the middle prefrontal cortex to the frontal cortex. And our brains kind of sit in our heads like this. So this is the front of your brain by your eyes. And so again, ideally, information is going to come up spinal cord, brainstem, limbic area, middle prefrontal cortex to the frontal cortex. The frontal cortex is where all of our logic and reasoning and life experience live. And the limbic area, our thumb here, is the area that stores experience apart from a concept of time and language. So that's ideally how information is going to flow throughout our brains a gabillion times a day, millisecond by millisecond. And we'll talk about this a couple of other times, but it's easier to introduce the idea and then talk about the concepts. And again, we'll go through this model a couple more times as we're talking today. So we'll talk about brain development. As we are growing, the brain has what's called bottom-up organization. So that means that the parts of our brains that are close in this hand model, the parts of our brains that are down here, so our brainstem, our limbic area, these kinds of things, these are really the lower parts of the brain, and then the higher parts of the brain up here, the frontal cortex and the other cortices that we have operating. So our brains develop from the bottom up. The bottom regions of the brain, like the brainstem and the midbrain, these parts of the brain control the most basic functions of our bodies. So that's our heart rate, breathing, blood pressure, digestion. These are the things that we don't have to think about. We don't have to take a moment and go, oh my goodness, I just ate dinner, so I will tell my stomach to begin the digestion process. These things happen without our attention. They just continue to go on when everything is functioning normally. So brainstem responses never go away while we're alive. And again, that brainstem drives those really basic metabolic functions that keep us alive. The top areas of the brain, the cortices, the middle prefrontal cortex, the frontal cortex, even up into the limbic area, control more complex functions like thinking, like emotion regulation, like evaluating good and bad, delaying gratification. All those things come from the top areas of the brain. So at birth, when we're born, the human brain is relatively undeveloped. Now it's there and it's all in its form, but the connections within the brain are what are relatively undeveloped right at birth. So of course our brain stems are functioning because babies live and breathe and they eat and they eat and burp and all those kinds of things that we find incredibly adorable when they're babies. I mean, maybe not as adorable as they grow older, but all those things are online when we're born, those basic metabolic functions. And then the other areas of the brain develop as we interact with our life and with our environment and with our caregivers. So as we are developed, other areas, as we go through the process of development, other areas of the brain are organized and become fully functional. So during childhood, the brain matures and the whole set of brain related capabilities, they develop in sequence. So again, it's bottom up organization, bottom up development. For example, so when babies are born, they don't do a lot, right? They can't even hold up their heads. And then over time, sequentially, they will gain control of holding their heads up. And then they'll learn to sit up, they'll learn to roll over, crawl, stand, walk. So again, it's a progressive development, and we see that. Similarly, babies can't speak, they can make some noise, they can cry when they're born, and then over time, they start babbling and experimenting with sounds, and then they'll begin to speak some individual words, put words together, sentences, and things like that. So again, it's that sequential process of development, and that is also the representation of the parts of the brain that are developing, again, from the bottom up. So why is this important? We're talking about attachment, Trish. Why do I care? What order things come online with the brain? Well, what is really important for us to recognize then with this bottom-up development is that our brains grow and mature based on these early experiences with our environment, interactions with our caregivers. So what that means then is that our experiences help shape brain growth, which then influences the way that we experience the world. For example, there's points of time in development where when the eye is developing within the body, and if, for example, someone's eyes would be, they'd have a blindfold on for some reason during a critical time of their eye developing, they might actually not develop the ability to understand what they see in the same way. So their eye would still take in information, and they would still see things, but that connection that we have to it would be much different. So what happens in our lives and in our relationships influences how our brains develop. So as relates to then the issues of attachment and developing connections with people, if as children and babies we are physically safe, we're emotionally nurtured, and we're well fed, our brains will develop neural networks that help us feel secure in the world. We will internalize that, and our brains will develop in such a way that it, in a sense, almost mirrors our experience. Now, if these three sets of needs, physical safety, emotional nurturing, and being fed, if these sets of needs are not met, our brains will develop or not develop neural networks in response to what we do and don't receive. So the great thing about our brains and how they are developed and how we as people, as human beings, are in the world is that our brains continually grow and develop as well. We know from the research on brain scans and neural development that new neural networks can always be created, so we can continue to learn and develop new things even as adults. But so this isn't we're not being condemned to living a life that leaves us stuck with the results of our early childhood experiences. We will have to work through them and develop some new neural networks in order to cope differently and to interact with the world differently and people and things like that. But those early experiences absolutely have influence on the wiring of our brains and the development of our brains as we're growing. So again, that coming back to that hand model of the brain. So it's spinal cord, brainstem, limbic area, middle prefrontal cortex, and the frontal cortex. So again, all of that brain development, it starts with the brainstem online, then the limbic area. And this is again where we store and experience things, again, as experience apart from language and time. Limbic area, middle prefrontal cortex to the frontal cortex. So as you can see then, this middle prefrontal cortex, which is kind of like these fingernails right here, they touch everything. So the middle prefrontal cortex actually wraps around and touches the brainstem. It goes through, it has connection with the limbic area. So the middle prefrontal cortex serves a really important integrating function in how the different structures of our brain communicate with each other. So we'll talk now about the process of attachment through the lens of interpersonal neurobiology. So a primer here. Again, because these are complex concepts, but they can be broken down into really understandable chunks of information. So the brain and the body are a complex and integrated system. As I mentioned from the beginning, they're not really separate. We, for the purposes of discussion and education, often talk about the mind-body connection, but really we are all a complex system, a single complex system. So again, moment to moment, millisecond to millisecond, that information is going back and forth with messages being shared from our body up to our brain and then back down and over and over and over again. So the idea of the mind, the concept of the mind, represents what's called, or how it's defined as the emergent, which means our minds emerge over time as our brains develop, the emergent self-organizing. So our brains will develop and the different parts of our brains and those neural networks will be organized within ourselves, self-organizing. So it's the emergent self-organizing process that shapes and directs how energy and information flow across time. And this is shaped by the interaction of experiences and gene expression. So, as I said, how our brains develop is influenced by our environment and by the people in our environment, by our primary caretakers and primary relationships. And we also, of course, are born with a set of genes and DNA that drive our development. And they work in concert. So, for example, if I grew up in an area where there's a war going on and literally like there's a bombing that happens every day, that might influence which genes are turned on and turned off. I might be highly vigilant, and that set of genes around vigilance might be turned on because that's part of staying safe. And that will have come out of my interaction with my environment. So again, our brains grow and develop, and those neural networks develop in response to those early experiences in relationship and with our environment. And as those things interact with our gene expression. So that's the idea of the nature or nurture. Well, it's both. It's a complex interaction. It's really kind of amazing and magnificent, frankly. But it is a complex interaction of both. Because our environment influences our brain development, influences gene expression, which then influences how we interact with our environment, which then influences what genes are turned on and off, which then influences how, again, we interact with our environment, and it's a cycle, and that's how that works forward. So it's absolutely both. And so when we think in terms of our body and brains as a single complex system, what are we talking about? What would a healthy, complex system look like? So now these ideas come from Dan Siegel, who's really kind of one of the founding members of the field of interpersonal neurobiology. And one of the things he talks about is that if you talk to a lawyer and ask them, did you study the law when you were in law school? And they will say yes. And if you talk to someone who's a physician and say, did you study medicine or the body and those body systems when you were in medical school? And they will say yes. And if you talk with somebody who's a mental health practitioner and ask them, did you study mental health in your graduate school? And until recently, really in the last 10 years, there's been a significant shift. But before then, most people would say, no, we studied psychopathology and all of those, the things that can go wrong, but we never came to that definition of what is mental health. So one of the things that field of interpersonal neurobiology offers us is a set of characteristics that help us identify what a healthy, complex system looks like. So there are these 5 characteristics of a healthy, complex system. So and it works into this acrostic or this acronym called FACES. So it's flexible, adaptive, coherent, energized, and stable. So flexible meaning that we are able to take in information from a variety of different sources. We're able to give information and responses through a variety of means, so we have that flexibility. We are adaptive. So that means, again, if we're in a situation where there's immediate physical threat, we can adapt to that and we can change the rhythms of our day-to-day life in order to stay safe. And then when that threat goes away or minimizes, we can then shift over into behaving in a way in our daily lives that represents the fact that our environment is safer. You will see people adapt to different personalities. You'll see this in teamwork and in families and in work situations. So having the ability to adapt to what's happening inside and outside. So coherent is the idea of directed. So if you think of light, for example, if you take light and focus it so it's all flowing in the same direction, it becomes a laser. That's coherent light. That'd be a coherent light beam. So that this a complex system will have a direction. It'll be energized. So meaning that there's an energy source. We're alive. We're human beings. We get energy from people interpersonally, from the food we eat, from rest, from those kinds of things. So we are an energized system. And when we don't have energy, that influences the whole system. So if we're sick, if we're sleep deprived, or if we're really well, and feeling really well energized, all those things will influence how we as a complex system operate. And then stable. So stable in a sense for people is also predictable, meaning, for example, if you meet me at work and you meet me at the grocery store and you meet me here in this virtual meeting room, I will be the same person in each situation. So there might be different events that are happening, different skills that are brought to bear, but ideally stable means you will find me to be the same person across contexts. So therefore, an individual with good mental health will generally exhibit these characteristics. And you can see how when these things get out of whack, we would start looking at somebody and asking them, are they okay? Under stress, some people can get really rigid because that helps them try to figure out and cope. And if somebody's, has been flexible and adaptive and starts veering toward being rigid and black and white, and those kinds of things, then we might ask them if they're okay. Or if someone seems kind of distracted or is kind of slapshod in the way that they're approaching things or taking in information, we might ask them if they're okay. If someone is sick or really tired, again, so you can see how when any of these different characteristics are off, they'll catch our attention. We're often better at noticing these things in other people than we are in ourselves. But over time, we can also develop the ability to observe these things in ourselves and give ourselves what we need as well. So then attachment, what is attachment? What does this mean? Let's just talk through that really, really briefly here. Attachment is a deep and enduring emotional bond that connects one person to another. Some people talk about if the attachment with someone is strong, they often feel felt. I heard a middle schooler describe it that way once, and that I feel felt, or I feel like that person carries me in their heart, or they understand me. Those are the things the kinds of statements and experiences and feelings that would help us identify that we have a strong attachment to someone. Our attachment style, how we attach with people and connect to them, defines and affects how we perceive the world and people in the world. And we'll talk about that more in a couple of minutes. And our attachment style, our attachment strategy, how we get our needs met, it tends to be determined by the attachment style or strategies of our primary caregivers. There's actually some studies that have been done in the field of attachment and interpersonal neurobiology that have been able to predict with a really, really high rate of high predictability, that the attachment style of the child based on the attachment style of the primary caregiver, often the mother, and they'll be right something like 85% of the time. So we tend to internalize those attachment strategies that our primary caregivers have had, and we also internalize, of course, the attachment styles if it's a two-parent family of both people. And another thing that's really important to remember is that every child grows up in a different family. So if it's a 3-unit family, for example, if it's maybe a mom and a dad and a child, that's a family system. If you add another child, that is a new family system, because now there's four people that are interacting. By the same token, if it's a single parent family, that 2-person family unit is going to have a way of being with each other and interacting with each other. If you add another child, or if you add another adult partner, that will change that family system. So a lot of times people will say, well, how come I have this, anxious attachment strategy and my sister is, seems to be securely attached? What's that? Well, that's because the same parent can have a different attachment style with each child, because again, that's a different family system. As soon as another child is added to the system, and then the parent has their temperament, the child has their temperament, and anybody who's raised children knows that the children are absolutely unique, and that they are born with their own temperament. And some children are born and they're super easygoing, and some children are born ready to take on the world, it seems, immediately. And so the different temperament style and the way of interacting with people in the world influences how we attach as well. And that's how we can have different attachment strategies as maybe many siblings in a family, instead of all having a single attachment, because perhaps we had the single same parent, the single same mother. So again, attachment is that connection. It's that bond that we share with people, and we tend to internalize the attachment strategy that we experience in relationship with our primary caregivers. So how does attachment develop? So this is it's intricately related to our mirror neuron system. Our mirror neurons are here, kind of between our eyes and our ears. And this fires whether or not we want it to. Our mirror neuron system is always on. There's a small population of people who actually are able to kind of turn their mirror neurons on and off. That's another category of, they would fit into that continuum of sociopath, psychopath. And those folks know that they can turn their mirror neurons on and off. And that's a whole nother discussion for another time. Most of us are born with a mirror neuron system that is on, and we don't get to choose whether or not we react to the emotional states of other people. So our mirror neuron system fires when a person acts. When we act in response to other people, and when we observe what other people are doing. So, for example, our mirror neurons are working when let's say you're talking with somebody who's crying and your eyes start to tear. That is your mirror neuron system at work. The mirror neuron system, this wiring allows for empathy and connection and attunement. And again, understanding that my mirror neuron system is always on, your mirror neuron system is always on, that means that we share emotional states with each other, whether or not we want to. It just happens. That's how we're wired. In particular, when we make eye contact with people, that's when we really share some of those really deep emotional states. Another thing to keep in mind then is that we will do well if we are responsible for what emotional state we are bringing into any interaction. If I come into an interaction and I'm already in an activated, agitated state, that's going to influence the person that I'm interacting with. And so, especially if we're in situations involving conflict or things that are highly conflict-ridden or contentious, we will do well to manage our emotional state. If I'm calm, I will have a better ability to help that other person remain calm just because of the shared emotional states. Not your responsibility to make them feel a certain way because we can't do that, but that can help keep the interaction functioning in a measured way. And again, so the mirror neuron system is what helps us. It allows for what's called attunement. So attunement is bringing into harmony the feeling of being connected with someone, that sense of attachment. Some people will talk about attunement as being at one-ment. So it's that sense that I feel like we are connected, we are understanding each other. Sometimes you meet people and you kind of feel that simpatico, and that would be attunement, when both mirror neuron systems are reflecting a sense of harmony with each other. And it goes back to, again, that idea of feeling felt or feeling seen, feeling understood. And we share our emotional states through that process of attunement, and we have the ability to really powerfully influence other people. Again, bringing that into interactions with other people can really help to help us feel better later about how we interacted, and can also sometimes really help an interaction go more smoothly if we're aware of that and managing our own interpersonal and our own emotional state. And it's also okay to, if we feel ourselves getting activated, to bow out or to request to come back to the topic, but and to acknowledge, I'm feeling activated. I might need to take a break and come back to this. So as we have better attunement with ourselves, as we better understand our own emotional states, we'll be better able to express them and then to use them in a constructive way. So attachment, again, I mentioned that we tend to internalize the attachment strategy of our primary caregivers. So there's several different types of attachment. There's what's called secure attachment or earned secure. Earned secure is the phrase that's used to indicate folks who came from a hard place and kind of worked their way through their attachment concerns and barriers and issues, and now function in a securely attached manner, but they weren't necessarily born that way, or their early environment didn't allow that to develop. So we have secure and earned secure. And then we have insecure attachment styles. So one of those is anxious or ambivalent. That's kind of these are folks who really want to be connected to people, but it really scares them. A way to view that kind of as a physical representation would be somebody who's like doing this. So, why come near me, come near me, come near me, come near me. I want this relationship. Whoa, you're way too close. And so it can feel confusing sometimes for the people who are in relationships with someone who is struggling with an anxious or an ambivalent attachment strategy. Ambivalent, the word ambivalent, ambi meaning both, valent meaning direction. So literally pulled in the two directions of wanting connection, but being afraid of it at the same time. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. And then there's dismissive or detached attachment strategy. So folks with a dismissive or detached attachment strategy tend to view relationships more in terms of tasks and roles. So, for example, one of the ways that we can help identify the attachment style someone is operating with is through the adult attachment interview. And this is a series of open-ended questions. So, for example, one of the early questions is basically describe your relationship with your mother. So someone with anxious or ambivalent attachment might say something like, my mom, we have a pretty good relationship. I can call her when I need to. But, just yesterday I was talking to her and she was comparing me and my sister. And, why does she always do that? And that, so what's happening is the past relationship is intervening in the current experience. So there's that again, that unfinished business is kind of the sense that you get with folks who are working with anxious or ambivalent attachment. So for someone with dismissive or a detached attachment strategy, again, viewing relationships more in terms of tasks and roles, if I would say to that person, describe your relationship with your mom, that person might say something like, you know, my mom was a good mom. You know, she had dinner on the table, the house was clean, we did our homework. She was a good mom, good mom. So what's missing from that? There's no discussion of a relationship. This is purely role function. So that's one of the ways that we can kind of understand someone who's coming from or utilizing a dismissive attachment strategy. And then there's what's called a disorganized or traumatic attachment. So it was originally called disorganized because it didn't seem to make sense, but it actually really does if you think in terms of what's going on. Someone with a disorganized or a traumatic attachment will feel pulled toward their caregiver, and that caregiver is a source of fear. And so they'll feel pulled toward and away. And if I'm feeling both of those things at the same time, what do I do? What can I do with that? It's a physiological, kind of a biological conundrum to have a drive toward our caregiver and a drive away from them as well. You know, I remember a study of watching the attachment strategies or evaluating attachment strategies of young children, and there was a case where the way that it's evaluated is called the strange situation. And so a parent will go into a room that has a stranger and also some toys and things like that, and they'll go in with the child, and then they will leave the child in that environment, and they'll be viewed while this is happening, and then they'll come back in. And it's how the child responds when the parent comes back in that helps identify what the attachment strategy is. So someone with a disorganized attachment strategy, the story is that it was a little girl, and the parent came back in the room, and she took a step forward and she took a step back, and then she put her arms out to the side and twirled in a circle, which is where the idea of like disorganized, I don't get that has nothing to do with what's happening because your parent is coming back in the room. But if you look at it from the view of somebody caught in that conundrum of feeling a drive toward our parent because they keep us safe, ideally, and a drive away from our parent because they scare me, that's actually a perfect illustration. So how does secure or earned secure attachment develop? What's the process of that? So a child will tend to develop a secure attachment strategy if they have contingent communication, auxiliary containment, and when a repair is made. So contingent communication is really the means that it's creating the conditions of emotional safety. So what does that mean? So contingent communication occurs when the parent or the caregiver perceives the cues of the child, interprets them accurately, responds appropriately in a timely manner most of the time. So for all of us guilt-ridden parents who bemoan the fact that we know we don't do it correctly all of the time, it's a most of the time kind of a situation. Some research says 60% of the time. Some research says, you know, as little as 40% of the time. But it's a most of the time situation. So let me walk you through that. What does that mean? So let's say a child falls down outside and skins their knee and comes inside to their parent. So the child comes inside, and let's say it's the mom. The mom sees that the child is tearful, their knee is bleeding. So they perceive the cues, oh, my child got hurt, interpret accurately, probably fell down and is coming to me for help and comfort, respond appropriately, which would be kind of the swooping in and, oh, sweetie, I'm so sorry, you pick them up and hug them and, maybe put a Band-Aid on, those kinds of things. So respond appropriately in a timely manner, right when they come in the door, most of the time. So how could that go differently? So let's say the child comes in, they're tearful, their knee is bleeding, and So my child is hurt. Perhaps maybe I interpret that correctly. My child is hurt. Interpret accurately. What if I interpret it inaccurately? What if I, have an attachment strategy that causes me to believe that you're doing things to bother me, right? So the child comes in, their knees bleeding, they're tearful, and I say, "Why do you always do this to me?" So that would be interpreting inaccurately, and then I would be responding inappropriately based on the situation, in a timely manner, doing it right away, but not helpful. So how can that happen then? Let's say I'm a parent. Let's say I have two kids. Let's say I've got one kid on my hip and I'm making dinner, and then my other child falls down inside and gets hurt and comes running to me tearfully. I might not be able to drop everything that I'm doing to respond to the child, or I might have to say, "Oh, give me 1 minute," because I might have to. If this is a young child that I have in my arm, I might have to put them in a carrier or something like that. So my response might be delayed. Even though if I'm responding appropriately and interpreting accurately, so it might be delayed. But again, it's that most of the time. So if that most of the time is what helps the child believe that you have my best interests at heart. And the other thing about most of the time, so what about all those times that it doesn't happen? Well, and that's number 3, when an injury occurs, a repair is made. So let's say we'll go back to the situation where I couldn't respond I couldn't respond immediately because, I was holding a baby and stirring a pot of, I don't know, spaghetti sauce. Actually, I have an image in my head of my mom holding something on her hip, not a baby, and then stirring a pot of spaghetti sauce. So anyway, then I could come back to the child, the one who got hurt, and be like, "Oh, I'm sorry, I couldn't get here right away. I had to set down your sister, your brother." But I can explain. Or, I think we've all had those situations where maybe we lost our cool, we were upset, we wish we weren't. We get to go back and correct it. We get to go back and make the repair. If you're someone that struggles with perfectionism, we often feel like we don't deserve it or we don't get to go back and make the repair. What we do, we absolutely do. And that's critical, because if we have done the other things of perceiving the cue, interpreting accurately, responding appropriately in a timely manner most of the time, then there's room for the repair because the child will believe it. And then number 2, auxiliary containment. This is really important. It's a foundation for integration later for the child understanding how to take care of themselves. So auxiliary containment is basically the caregiver or the parent holding the things that are too big for the child emotionally. So a good picture of that would be, let's say that child who skinned their knee and comes in the door, I swoop them up and I hold them. So like this, and their head is here, their back is here, and I'm holding them and I'm saying, "It's okay, I've got you." So if you think of it kind of in realistic terms, does that make sense? Well, yeah, their knee is still skinned, they still bleeding, they still fell down, they still got hurt. But what we're saying is, I am going to take care of you. So they'll, hug the child, "I've got you, it's okay." And then over time, we give that back to the child as they develop in their ability to take care of themselves. Secure attachment, that contingent communication, the auxiliary containment, and then when the injury occurs, we make the repair. So again, talking through this a little bit. So the insecure or the anxious ambivalent type, this arises out of a parent with some unfinished business. So that might be, again, someone who is preoccupied with other issues. They are available inconsistently, and sometimes they may be intrusive. So sometimes the parent might, swoop in, do the hug, the auxiliary containment, help take care of the child, and that's great. Sometimes the parent, if they're preoccupied with something else, might not respond at all, or might have that, why are you always trying to bother me? That kind of a thing. Or they might come in and do too much. They might infantilize the child, or try to take over or own the child's emotions. So that's not safe anymore, because it's going to feel like whatever happens is going to become my moms or my parents, they're going to take it over from me. So that parent is available inconsistently, but available sometimes. And that's where that kind of come near me, go away thing comes from. Because sometimes my needs get met and sometimes they don't. So I don't know. I really want my needs to get met, but I'm scared. People who are in relationship with folks struggling with insecure attachment can get really tired. Because they don't know who they're going to get. Are they going to get this person they can attach to? Or are they going to get this who's emotionally available? Or are they going to get this other kind of anxious or angry or whatever it might be person who's going to show up? For insecure dismissive type, again, those relationships are viewed as tasks and people are viewed in roles. As they look back on their childhood, these folks often don't have a ton of memories. So it doesn't mean that if you don't have a bunch of memories that you're dismissively attached. That can be a function of a lot of things, but it is fairly typical. And that develops when the primary caregiver is unavailable. And these kids as adults actually can feel kind of like the Death Star with the force field. Like you just can't get in. It doesn't matter how you take the Millennium Falcon or the little X-wing fighter, Star Wars analogy, Star Wars reference. You can't get in. You can't get through. They're just impervious, and that can be really hard. Those folks don't tend to come into counseling. They tend to be brought in by a partner because that's the nature of it. They're very, very self-sufficient. And what's really sad about this is that means that child's bid for connection was rebuffed. It was dismissed over and over and over and over and over so many times that they developed the belief that they're not even going to try anymore. And then the insecure traumatic attachment or disorganized attachment style. So this again comes from that biological conundrum. We have a drive to be near our primary caregiver because they are the source of love, care, food, all that protection. But they might also be a source of pain and fear for us. And that's how that is developed, is when the parent is a source of fear or pain. So if a parent is actively addicted to anything, that can cause traumatic attachment. If they're abusive, that can cause traumatic attachment. If the parent leaves the child with and doesn't come back for long periods of time, those kinds of things can cause traumatic attachment. I apologize for the sounds of the animals in the background. I have a very large dog and 3 cats. They're lovely if you love pets. So now, how does this work then? So we internalize the attachment strategy of our primary caregiver. So we connect with our primary caregiver. Attunement, those mirror neurons, these are on even when we're babies. So we connect, we internalize the emotional state, the attachment strategy of that caregiver. And if this is a secure attachment relationship, then I learn integration and containment. So that parent is safe and helps me learn how to manage myself, interact with the world, keeps me safe when I need it. And then I will develop a sense that the world is basically good and I'm okay. And then that influences how I perceive and interpret the world. So if that's going on, if I'm securely attached and let's say I'm walking down a hallway, my friend is walking toward me from the other direction and they have a frown on their face, I might see that and go, that person looks upset, and I might approach them and see what's wrong. And which then influences how that person responds to me. They might respond to me like I'm caring and concerned and trustworthy, and they'll, I just had this horrible interaction with, my boss, and I'm just really upset, and then we can have some relationship and discuss, and then move on from there, but that influences that. So then let's say with anxious or ambivalent attachment. So we got mirror neurons. I'm attuning to my primary caregiver. We're sharing our emotional states. I'm internalizing that attachment style. But again, that parent is inconsistently available. So the integration of myself as an individual separate from the world and containment of emotion is going to be intermittent. So it's inconsistent, just like that parent's availability has been inconsistent. So then that will, I'll grow up with kind of a sense that I will develop a sense that the world is unpredictable and I'm nervous. And then that will influence how I perceive and interpret actions within the world. So that same situation then where someone is walking down, I'm walking down the hallway, someone's coming from the opposite direction with a frown. If I have this anxious attachment style, I'll see the frown and I might think, oh my gosh, they must be mad at me. What did I do? And I'm going to run through, did I do this? Maybe I didn't call them in time. Maybe I should have called in time. I don't understand. And then I'm going to not know why they're mad. I'm going to assume it has to do with me. And then I might not even make eye contact. I might avoid them. And then that person is going to be like, oh my gosh, what? I don't understand. Or I might interpret it like they're mad at me. So, come to them, and they're frowning. Well, what did I do? Why are you so mad at me? What can I? And that person is going to be again like, oh my gosh. And so they're going to react to me like, wow, you're a bunch of work. You're really hard. Or like, I'm not going to share anything with you. Or they might say, I'm fine. Oh, I'm fine. I'm fine. But I might know my senses. I know they're not fine, but they're not sharing it with me, which is then going to influence how I perceive and interpret the world. So I'm going to get this back from them because I'm going to be hard. I'm going to be unpredictable. And a lot of people are going to develop a distance with me because, again, I'm a lot of work. Like when I can show up and I'm available, I'm great. But when I have all this other stuff going on, that's hard. So that will just reinforce then that that I want people to come. They might hurt me. They might reject me. They might not be there for me. And I'm going to treat them that way. And you can see how that cycle will perpetuate. Then with a dismissive or detached attachment strategy. So again, I'm trying to connect with my parent, with my primary caregiver, mirror neurons. We're attuning to each other. I internalize that emotional state, that attachment strategy. And what I've received is either rigid or unavailable integration and containment. Again, my bids for connection have been rebuffed time and time again, a million times over and over. So I'm going to develop a sense that the world is cold and unhelpful, and I'm separate. And I would add, and I'm kind of okay with that because that's how I've developed, that's how I've grown and developed my understanding of the world. So then that, again, influences my perception and interpretation of my interactions with other people. So here's that situation. I'm walking down the hall. Somebody's walking toward me with a frown. If I'm that person with dismissive attachment and I see that person with a frown, I'm going to walk the other way. I'm going to look down. I'm not going to make eye contact because my thought is going to be, that person's always mad, or, that's not something I want to deal with right now, or I have a really big deadline. I can't go spend time talking with this other person, but I'm going to have a reason and I'm not going to engage. And then that person, of course, is going to respond to me in a similar manner, like either they'll just continue on and not make eye contact with me because they see that I'm not being available. People won't choose to be necessarily very close to me. And that will, again, continue to reinforce that that's how the world operates and that's how people are. And then finally, for the traumatic or disorganized attachment. So I'm trying to connect with my parent, mirror neurons. I'm attuning, I'm internalizing their emotional state, their attachment strategy. And the integration or the containment that I get from that parent is going to be fragmented or sparse, or intrusive or abusive, that kind of a thing, or there's no containment at all. So if a parent is intrusive or abusive or fragmented or unavailable or neglectful, they're not paying attention to my emotions. They are not providing any containment for me of those things that feel bigger than I do. So then I will develop a sense that the world is scary and I am unprotected. And so we'll go again, that'll influence how I perceive and interpret the world. So we'll use that situation again. I'm walking down the hall, somebody comes walking toward me with a frown on their face, and I might decide that they're going to hurt me. So, I might come in, and this is an extreme example, of course, but, what are you mad at? Why are you always mad at me? And sock them, punch them in the jaw. Anybody who knows me, that's totally not my temperament. But anyway, but that would be that kind of a thing where I'm going to actually misinterpret what that person's emotional state is because I don't know how. I haven't been given anything that helps me understand that. So People are going to be, the world is scary, I'm unprotected, you might be scary, you might be going to hurt me if you're mad. Bad things happen when mad people are around. It might not occur to me that you're going to be sad, or if you are sad, it's going to be because I caused it, those kinds of things. So, and I'll interact with the world that way, and I will get those responses then from other people. People are going to be kind of avoidant of folks, can be avoidant of folks with traumatic attachment because they don't know what they're going to get either, or they feel misunderstood, which you can see where that could occur if I am misunderstanding, misinterpreting how that person's behaving. So again, the concepts then of attachment and interpersonal neurobiology are that we are influenced by and we influence people and environments. Again, we share those emotional states, whether we're planning to or not. So we have great influence on those, on people and on our environments. Our minds will filter and define our experiences and perceptions based on our history to date. So this is not static. We can learn new things, as we talked from in the very beginning. We develop new neural networks. We can develop that over time. It doesn't matter how old we are. And often you'll see that every 90 to 180 days, the networks will become a little more established. And so, you might notice then in the growth of a child, every 3 to 6 months, we might see a real milestone with people with babies sitting up, crawling, walking. They kind of happen in every, 3-month milestones. As pertains to addiction and sobriety, people will talk about that first 30 days, that first 3 months is the most vulnerable. And that's because you're just in the process of beginning new neural networks. They're not developed yet, but they're going to be if you stick with it. And so, let's say you're going through therapy or you're working on a skill or you're developing new habits. What you'll find is over time, they get easier and easier because those new neural networks are being laid down and established. And then pretty soon you get to a point where you don't even have to think about it. Someone who's habituated to, let's say they get up every morning and work out. There comes a point where that's a non-issue. That's just what they do. That's part of their life. But in the beginning, you bet they had to figure out how to do it, and I don't want to do it, and all those kinds of things. But then they'll develop that habituated way of being. Or, some people who maybe they're really reactive and they tend to get angry quickly and they want to work on that, and they'll have a lot of other strategies, but maybe their first strategy is that something happens and they take a deep breath and count to 10. And maybe over time they do that enough that it becomes habituated so they don't even have to think about it. Whereas in the beginning, when something happens, they might have to be like, okay, got to take a breath and count to 10. I'm going to do these things, to try to be calm. So we get to see the evidence of those things over time as things become easier and easier to do, again, become habituated. We will, so anyway, I apologize. So going back to that, we will filter and define our experience and perception based on our history to date. So that means, like right now, if I start working on something, if there's something that I want to change, my history up until now is going to influence how I perceive myself, how I perceive the world, those kinds of things. But I can start a new history starting now. That's why it's not static. So 3 months from now, I might have a different 3-month history than I had up until that point. And you might hear people say, I used to really struggle with, consistency or anger or something like that. But, then I got into therapy, or then I read this book, or this happened or that happened. And now that's not a problem anymore. So they had a history to a point, and then they started a new history. We literally get to start a new history if we want to, but it'll take focused attention, of course. We will act, react, and respond in accordance with our self-defined experiences and perceptions, just like we were talking about that self-fulfilling prophecy about how we perceive and interpret the world around us. So we will act and react in accordance with those things, consistently with those beliefs, unless we start working on shifting those patterns. Our interaction with people and environments will affect which genes are turned on and off, again, called gene expression. This is a complicated process. I'm not going to go into any great detail. I'm not a microbiologist. It's super interesting reading if you're into that kind of thing. What you want to look up, the topic is called epigenetics, and that talks about how the environment we're in and our interactions influence which genes are turned on and off. Really interesting. But our interactions with people and environments will affect which genes are turned on and off. And again, which influences how we interact with our environment and people, which influences which genes are turned on and off. So again, it's that it's that sense of reciprocal. It's a reciprocal process. And our life experiences influence genetic coding and the wiring in our brains and our bodies. Again, that's epigenetics. And so you'll sometimes find that there are people who come from abusive family systems, and they will be the people that are like, it stops here. And so what happens is at that point they might start dealing with the abuse. They might refuse to be abusive, or to maintain a stance of being consistently victimized, that kind of thing. And they're really kind of heroic, frankly, and really courageous, those folks who make that determination that, this pattern stops here, because they'll get all the waves of the old system, the old family system kind of, comes up against them. It's almost like they're a brick wall, and there's a big, huge wave that comes up and it batters the wall, but the wall holds. And then there's a new history moving forward for their children and their families moving forward. And that will influence which genes are then passed down. Some of the early studies that were done in epigenetics were around children or young adults who had a parent with depression, significant depression. And what it found is that left a marker on the child's certain DNA strand. It didn't change their DNA, not saying that, but it influenced the genes around it that were expressed. And what we'll find then is that history, that experience of having that depressed parent, will significantly influence that child and how they develop. And there's something like 80% more likely to develop depression, and even to be at risk for death by suicide when they're in their late teens and early 20s. And what that early research found was that this could actually be passed down for several generations. And so again, those folks who choose to be the folks who stand in the gap and say this far and no further, they're literally rewiring their brains and then helping the brains of their children wire in a different manner. So those again are the basic concepts of attachment interpersonal neurobiology. So I know we've covered a lot, we've talked a lot, and we're coming up on actually close to an hour now. So I would invite you to join this exercise with me really quickly. Just take a deep breath, close your eyes if you'd like. Take another deep breath. There you go. Now think about the process of developing attachment that we've just talked about and the different attachment strategies. Which attachment style or strategy do you think you might have? Does this surprise you in any way? And does this shift how you view yourself? Does it shift how you view your parents? Does it shift how you view your children? Does it shift how you want to, maybe how you might want to start interacting differently with your parents and your children and your partner and your friends? And then are you thinking about other people who should hear this information? And why do you think that? A lot of times we care for people, and it's really hard to interact with them, and we can look back and see, oh my goodness, I think that they have an anxious attachment strategy or a dismissive attachment strategy. And maybe what this is telling us is that with our understanding, we can engage with them in a manner that doesn't hurt us, or is easier for us to join them. So take another nice deep breath. If your eyes were closed, go ahead and open them. So we will be, I would invite you, I apologize, I invite you to write down any of your thoughts as we just kind of walked through that. Any of your thoughts, your feelings, your reactions, any connections you made, any ahas you might have had throughout the discussion, understanding that we took kind of a sip of water from a fire hydrant right here. But I do encourage you to consider writing those things down. I invite you to write them down, because these ideas, I apologize for the typo there, but they tend to leave quickly if we don't capture them. It's funny because in the moment we're like, I'm going to remember this. This was an aha. This this helped, I saw a whole bunch of things more clearly. But ironically, issues of attachment are so kind of deeply woven into us that we'll often kind of forget what it was, those connections that we made, until we've thought about them and acted on them several times over time. So I do invite you to write them down. And then, as we talked about at the beginning here, we're going to have a live question and answer session in about 2 weeks. Stay tuned on the Patiently Waiting website for more information about that. And if you have any questions, comments, thoughts, we'll gather together in this virtual world and be able to answer any questions. And then in February, we will be looking at trauma and how trauma influences brain development and how it can influence attachment as well, as we talked about here with disorganized attachment. So I want to thank you again. I have a number of references. If you're somebody who likes to take pictures and is interested in those, I'll just flash through these really quickly if you want to take a screenshot or take a picture of that. I've been studying attachment for a long time. It's endlessly interesting and encouraging to me because we really do get to grow and change. It's never too late when it comes to attachment and working on those barriers and issues and challenges that we have. So thank you again so much for joining me tonight. It's really been a pleasure to talk with you. This is the first time that I've recorded. I've done a self-recording here, so hopefully my skill and engagement style will get better over time, and maybe next time I'll keep the animals on a different floor. So thank you again. I look forward to meeting with you again very soon.